I've not done field work for this particular project yet. I'm supposed to go on the field in a couple of months, but I've conducted a lot of field research in Uganda for my PhD on very similar topics. So, I mean, I've had the opportunity to follow some of the people who are serial callers and who use mobile phones to participate in radio discussions and to listen to a lot of these programs. So, what I'll do here is that I'll give elements about the Ugandan context that are, in my opinion, useful to discuss the research questions that Eugene and Sharon have already presented. And I think, actually, the Ugandan political configuration is a rich example to discuss these questions and to give preliminary answers because of the history of the regime in place, the National Resistance Movement regime, and because of the importance of the pre-colonial kingdom of Uganda inside the political life and in political imaginaries and how people imagine their citizenship and their belonging. So the first research question is, as Eugenia said earlier, in what ways is the ability to interact in public discussions using ICTs of intrinsic value to individual sense of political agency? So it's trying to understand how ICTs matter to people and how individuals value these venues of discussion and how they interpret and how they evaluate them. So it encourages us to dig into political imaginaries, to see how discussions through mobile phone and radio are integrated in existing social, political, and moral practices, networks, and representations, and how they transform them, actually. So one of the things that I have observed in Kampala is the connection between these radio discussions on the one hand and university politics, campus politics, party politics, and kingdom politics on the other. And that part of the success of these talk shows in terms of how many people send SMS and how many people call and listen is linked to their intertwining with these political and social forms of mobilization as well as to specific individual ambitions. So what's interesting is that they have effects in some unexpected ways, actually. In particular, ICT radio-mediated forms of communication feed and enter and transform relations of patronage and political training. And they trigger expressions of certain forms of political agency that draw the lines of a model of what I call the citizenship of distinction. And I will come back on that. I think 2 points can be raised here in terms of methodology and also political theory. And one is about the slippery nature, actually, of the distinction between citizens and elites. When actually interactive talk shows seems very much to be of an intermediary nature, at least in the case of Kampala, which is a bit specific. But that's to say that many listeners call in because they say that they want to enlighten the local people and to teach the masses, and because they want to be noticed by powerful political mentors and to engage in a political career. So many of the people who call in and use their mobile phones to participate in these radio discussions in Kampala are young, educated men who want to reassure themselves and their entourage that they are intellectuals and to prove their political and intellectual value by making a contribution in political talk shows. And also, Eugenio mentioned this issue, but about the kind of strategic investment of these venues of discussion by some individuals and for their personal advancement, and sometimes the fact that they are paid to call in or to send an SMS to a political talk show. I think, and you're right, that it's important not to view these specific practices or uses as artificial or unauthentic and to dismiss them as pure manipulation. Because actually, if you take them seriously, they're really interesting in terms of observing transformations inside party politics and intra-party politics, and in terms of transformations of clientele and patronage relationship. And that's why I wanted to show you this illustration that I like a lot, which was published last year in a Uganda-speaking newspaper. So you see a slightly overweight MP with a suitcase full of money and with a kind of scared look on his face. And so he's trapped in something that looks like an ambush, actually. And these young guys who are here, and some of them are holding mobile phones, and one of them is saying, we call on the radio, so you should give us money so that we can talk well about you. And actually, as Eugenia said, some of these callers or serial callers really became prominent figures and get in touch with MPs or local leaders. And what's interesting with this illustration is that it shows also that the relationship between scholars and MPs or political leaders is quite ambiguous. And here I refer to the frightened look of that person, in the term that the dependency relationship is of course a dependency relationship, but it's ambiguous in the sense that it also gives some leverage to these people who use their mobile phones in order to negotiate their dependency, in a sense, and to enhance their own situation. So, apart from these serial callers and these people who are looking for mentors or patrons by calling and sending SMSs to political talk shows, there are other interesting practices and uses and prolongements of these venues of discussion. And particularly training sessions for talk show callers and SMS senders, which are organized by both opposition political parties and the regime through a governmental agency called the Media Center. So it's also interesting to use these venues of discussion in order to understand how the political communication of the regime is changing and is transforming itself. And also the creation of associations of talk show callers, especially by second-rung cadres of the ruling party, the National Resistance Movement. They have very elaborate names. One of them is called the National Movement Media Network, and the other the Movement Mobilizers Media Network. So these associations gather people calling or send SMSs or send letters to newspapers, and these second-rung NRM cadres are using them to gain visibility inside their own parties. So it's an interesting phenomenon to observe. Of course, all these different phenomena might be very dependent from the Kampala urban context where I carried my research, but nevertheless, I think they are interesting, even from this situated point of observation, in terms of drawing some general methodological suggestion, and in the sense that it's important to observe how these ICT-mediated radio discussions are integrated in sociability and mobilization practices and routines that might not be obvious, even if you conduct interviews with people who call in or send SMSs in these talk shows. Usually in Uganda, they are called people's parliaments, so people insist a lot on the fact that they are very democratic and that anyone can call and can participate and everything. But actually, when you look a bit deeper into all that, you really see the ambivalence of the word people's parliaments. It's not that anyone can be a parliamentarian in the people's parliament. It's that these people think that they are representative of other people who are not competent enough. So it's not really some kind of promotion of participatory democracy. It's more promotion of representative democracy, because these guys think that they represent the masses who are not competent enough. So it's interesting to go a bit beyond the first discourses that you can have when you talk to people about these things. So the second research question is worded: to what extent are citizen-led governance interactions engendered by ICT innovations instrumentally useful in changing political outcomes, in having effects on policies? So this question is, I think, particularly important, but also very challenging in terms of methodology. How do we isolate the parameters and attribute change to these ICT radio-mediated discussions, and how can we proceed? So I think for this reason, it's interesting to link this question to the last research question that we mentioned here, which is about how RCTs are shaping or altering informal and formal governance institutions and practices. Because I think one way of answering this question is to follow on a day-to-day basis and to use ethnographic methodologies to follow political leaders and to see how responsive they are to these venues of participation and how much they feel obliged to frequent the studios and who actually frequents the studios, because what I could observe is that there are a lot of discrepancies between the kind of MPs in particular who frequent the studios, and in Kampala, the ones who were always ready to answer the journalist solicitations were in general young MPs who had just been elected, coming from very remote areas, and who really wanted to build the bases in Kampala and to have more visibility. So it's interesting because it's a way of measuring quite concretely links and practices of accountability and the conditions of accountability. And it's also, I think this research question is interesting, in particular in the case of Uganda and Kenya, maybe less than the other, I'm not so familiar, because it's also a way of analyzing the weight and the influence of the general political context and the state on how these radio discussions are organized and how politicians are responding to these citizen solicitations. For example, in Kampala, there were a lot of debates and a lot of engagement from the part of the citizens in these debates around the land issues. And I mean, if you spend time in Kampala and listen to these talk shows, there was some kind of, you had an image, at least, you had the impression that there was a consensus against the land reforms. But there was no response at all from the government in terms of altering the reforms that it wanted to promote. And so, I mean, it's interesting to see that in that case there was no answer, and that the claims that citizens were making through these venues of participation were not acknowledged by the authorities as legitimate. So I think what's interesting in that case is that it helps us analyze how a claim has to be framed, or through which venue it has to be carried in order to be acknowledged and by the state and considered as legitimate and considered as an acceptable form of claim yeah. So, but I think this is also linked to, it might be a bit easier to answer that question in a more in a local configuration, because I was observing these talk shows in Kampala. So, I mean, maybe what you did in Kisumu was maybe easier in terms of observing how local leaders answer to a more localized kind of audience, which is targeted by the smaller radio stations and the websites. So in Kampala, so I think, I mean, the context in which the observations take place is really important in terms of how we can better answer this question. The last research question was, in what ways are interactions experienced through ICTs constructively important in shaping citizens' value formation processes, including ideas of citizenship? So this question is about the effects of these venues and the engagement in ICT radio-mediated discussions in the formation of values and their effects on how people think about certain issues, and particularly on how people imagine citizenship and how they, on what it means to be a citizen for the people who engage in these talk shows. And here, the Ugandan context is interesting as well because of, in particular, when you look at the radio of the Kingdom of Uganda, CBS, and because in that case, interactive talk shows were one of the major means and spaces of the reinvention of the kingdom. The kingdom was abolished in the 1960s and was only reinstalled in the 1990s, so there were 27 years when it officially didn't exist. And so when it was reinstalled in 1993, 3 years later, it created this radio station, which is now the most popular radio station in Uganda, actually. And what's interesting is that talk shows were really not only one of the main venues of promotion of a reinvented and perpetually reinvented ideology around the kingdom and values and Ugandan nationalism, but it was also the cradle of the emergence of new political elites which were attached to the kingdom. And actually, former radio talk shows in this radio station were recently elected MPs in the last election. So these people used radio talk shows and combined it with party and electoral politics. So it was one of the major venues where how to be a Muganda and what it means to be a Muganda was discussed. So the place of the kingdom was discussed, the relationship it had with the central state, and etc. was discussed, and it was also a place where the celebration of how to be a Muganda was heavily discussed and linked to the idea of being loyal to the king. So what's interesting with the discussions on the radio, on this radio, is that the rules of speech were really celebrating one's submission to the king and one being loyal to the king. And interactive talk shows and people calling in and sending the SMS, people listening to these talk shows were using this to evaluate one's loyalty to the king and even one's real identity as Uganda. Because all the debates in these talk shows were about if this person doesn't show enough loyalty to the king, so it means that he cannot be a real Muganda. He's a false Muganda who's taking a Muganda name, but cannot be a real Muganda because he doesn't show enough loyalty to the king. And so this theme became really popular in day-to-day discussions in Kampala, and even a very popular singer made a song about that, about the people who send messages and who call in radio talk shows and criticize the king, even if they have a Muganda name, so they cannot be real Baganda. So in that case, ICT radio-mediated discussions were a way to interrogate this loyalty and, as such, the identity and the civism of the people who are calling in. So what's interesting there is that using, as researchers, using these spheres of discussion helps us really to seize ongoing debates on the basis, the local basis of what it means to be racist.